How you doing? Sunday night. I threatened to do this again. Sunday night chat. I put a thing on the internet the other day, yesterday. What should I talk about? And I only had a few responses. One was, you want to know where I grew up and what it was like when I was a kid. Another guy wants a tour of the apartment, basically, all the cool stuff I have. That's coming. There's a lot of stuff here, and I'll do that. But I've been too lazy to clean up the place enough to do that. More stories, whatever topic I want. They just like listening to me talk. And then another guy wanted to talk about the Marine Corps. But I sent him, and I posted a link. There's a playlist of videos I did talking about when I was in the Marine Corps. 1986, right here. Uh, this time of year 1986, Easter weekend, I had gotten busted. It was the worst year of my life in the Marine Corps. Probably the worst year of my life ever. And we were up, me and my buddies. I had a couple really good friends at the time. My one friend, Ralph. We were talking about Easter and what it was like in the mornings. And we always had an Easter basket and a toy. And he came back later that night. I had passed out, loaded. And he knocked on the door, woke me up, and I opened up the door. And he made up some excuse, but what I didn't know is he had reached in and unlocked the door. So a little while later, they had snuck in, knowing I was asleep. And when I woke up in the morning, there was an Easter basket next to my bed, and those were some good friends. So a couple things we're going to talk about now. I'm going to talk about my dad a little bit, which ties in a little bit with where I'm from and childhood. It's honey Jack Daniels and coffee liqueur. I call it a Tennessee Chola. Somebody else asked me what I was drinking last week. One drink a week. That's it. That's my thing now. So, I'm going to get into this, and I think I'm going to get into how I found my brother as well. So, as far as my dad goes, if you've been here long enough, you've heard my dad was born 1936 in Greece, up in the mountains there. And the first 9 years of his life was just surviving World War II. And then from 1945 to 1950 was the Greek Civil War. And the way he always explained it to me was they took two kids from every village, they sent them to Athens, and they trained them. And they were trained by British SAS and American OSS. And, he participated in the Greek Civil War, did a lot of effed up stuff. But he never really elaborated on that. That's all I'm going to say about that. It goes to mindset and the type of person he was. Because as a kid, he was taking me hunting. My mother had family in Wisconsin, so we lived up there before the age of 5. I turned 5 in Wisconsin. I remember that. Every summer we were at the Jersey Shore because my dad had a bakery there. He had that before he ever met my mom. And he was taking me hunting as early as 3 years old. And I had this great thing with my dad because I was not afraid of anything. If he said I could do it, I did it. And if I asked to do something, he let me do it, I did it. Because I have these vivid memories of him holding a rifle to my shoulder and let me reach out and squeeze the trigger, and when I did that, kaboom, it knocked me back into a tree, and it was wild. It was awesome. And I remember that same year, small game season, his buddies and him, they took me out hunting, and they put me in this ditch. I know I've told this before, but they put me in this kind of divot in the ground. So I remember it was all full of leaves. I'm 3. And there's bags of sandwiches and beer and stuff, and I've got this little Thompson machine gun, water gun. It was miniature, but it was scaled perfect to my size, to my stature, And I'm hearing gunshots go off all around me, and as the guys would come back with a pheasant or a squirrel or a rabbit, that's the main things that they were hitting. They'd go, hey, and they'd hold up the animal, the dead animal next to a tree, and they go, shoot, and I go, bang, 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 and they drop it. So they're literally training me to be a killer, 3 years old. One of my earliest memories with my dad could ride horses. He was really, really good on a horse. And where they board horses in Jersey, They probably do this everywhere. They also board stallions, and they board racehorses there, that sort of thing. So he would grease the people that own the stables to ride one of these racehorses. I got a great picture of him somewhere on a thoroughbred racehorse. You know, I mean, you just see the animal. There's no mistaking it. And I have this memory in front of him on the saddle. And he's got his left arm at my belly. He's like holding on to me. And he's got the reins in his other hand. And we're going full gallop through the forest. And just trees. And I remember like almost falling, and he's getting me back. He kept repositioning me in front of him, and he's got his feet in the stirrups, his body weight's on his legs, and he's full gallop through the forest like that with a little baby, basically. I don't know how old I was. I wasn't even 3 at that time. I was pretty freaking small, and I won't tell you what my earliest memory is because it's pretty depressing. I was hanging out with Wonder Hussy last month, whenever it was, and there was a few of us hanging out in her pad, me, her, and her sister, and Vic. And they were talking about their childhood and first memories and whatnot. And I was just listening. And then I told them my first memory, and it was like, oh, sorry. It was pretty bad. But growing up with my dad, he was always taking me places. And he was always introducing me to people. And I'm bringing this up because there's a story I've told before. And I've always said it was a hunting story. But I was telling Corinne, my friend who was visiting me here last month, or earlier this month, whenever it was, weeks ago, and I had an epiphany while I was telling her the story because it didn't make any sense. But I want to give you just a little bit more background before I get to it. Because as a little kid, he would take me into the city a lot. He would take me to these weird places. I don't remember them all. I can't really describe them because I was really small. But I remember grown men coming up to me and shaking my hand and telling me how much they respected my father. That would always happen. My whole life up until my parents getting divorced, whenever we went out someplace, strangers would walk up to me and shake my hand, tell me how much they respected my father. And my godmother, when I was born, she was a kid. And her dad was a mob guy, straight up. He owned a bunch of diners in Jersey, and they ran the numbers out of there, and he used to go to jail a lot for them, like a fall guy, and they would take care of the family and all that. And their house was like a movie, it was wild. And I just have I could sit here and just try to describe to you these stories of being a young kid and him taking me into the city and North Jersey and other places. And these are people that I would never see again, which was odd. And I did help my dad when I got a little bit older, when I was like 11, 12, 13, and my father was a really good baker. He owned a bakery, then that fell apart for family reasons. He started doing diners, but he was a great cake decorator, and he would do these crazy wedding cakes. And he would do wedding cakes for mobsters. And I have these memories of helping him set up these wedding cakes at these, crazy event, those types of weddings. And I'm bringing this up because of this story. And this is the story. And I'm sure I've told this before, but I'm going to give it a little bit more nuance right now because I'm really questioning this. My father never talked about his wartime experience as a kid in Greece. He told me how he was trained, and, he just always blew it off like, oh, it was like the Boy Scouts with guns. Because he said they learned how to throw hand grenades and fire machine guns, all this other stuff, but he never got into the nitty gritty of it. But one of the worst stories he ever told me was he was gone for 4 years, left the house at 9 years old, comes home, he's like 14, and he was only home for like 6 months. He always called him the socialist, came through, and they had gotten his uncle, the priest in town, and the teacher, and the socialists murdered them in front of the village and cut them up into pieces and stacked the body parts in front of his house. His dad was the mayor, and him and his father had run off and hid in the hills. They were probably after him too. Knowing what I know now, as a grown man and having been in the military and big into history and everything, it sounds like what he was going through there with the whole, that program where they were taking the kids and sending them to Greece. That's like special forces stuff. Like that's what they do. So they did in Vietnam with the Montagnards, you know, and so they deal with the indigenous peoples. They train a percentage of them, and the idea is those people are supposed to go back to their villages and train them. That's the pattern that it sounds like. There's research out there on it. There's not a lot of information on it, but you could look it up. And I had a belt buckle from him. It actually had a Boy Scout emblem on it, but in Greek it said something like the Boys Army. I gave it to my brother. I need to get that back just so I can do a video on it, and then I, let him have it again. But yeah, so there was this time. This epiphany thing I had. There's this hunting story. Keep it in mind, I'd been hunting with my dad ever since I was probably in diapers. Who knows how young I was when he first started taking me out there. But I vividly remember things when I was 3 years old. And he was taking out, sleeping on the ground overnight, all kinds of crazy stuff. Living off the land, not bringing any food, setting snares. I've told all these stories before. So, but typically when we went on a hunting trip, it was, you leave before the sun comes up. And sometimes we'd hit a diner or something, have breakfast. Again, all before the sun came up. And then you get out into the woods, you stalk around, and all before the sun comes up, you sit there and you're quiet, and then you shut the fuck up and you wait for something to walk by, basically. Or you stalk around, or he had me flush something, or whatever. And this was an odd trip. We're going on a hunting trip, and I've always told this is a hunting trip, but it made no sense. And as I was repeating this story to her, it hit me. This doesn't make any sense, but this is what happened. We left in the afternoon, and it was the fall. I'm pretty certain it was hunting season because the sun went down pretty early. But we left in the afternoon, pretty late afternoon, which doesn't make any sense. I'm assuming we were in Jersey. It was Jersey for sure, but I don't know where. I was too young to remember where. And that's the other weird thing, because we almost always hunted at the Delaware Water Gap. And we parked. I don't think we walked very far, and there was a mountain. And we climbed the mountain. And I mean climbed a mountain. Not walked up a path. I'm talking climbing on rocks and stuff. And I know that I was probably 8 years old. It was before I was 9 years old for sure. So imagine, 8 years old with your dad, late afternoon, climbing a mountain. And the sun went down, and we kept climbing until it got too dark to climb anymore. And there was a ledge. And we had sleeping bags. We rolled the sleeping bags. We're on a ledge. Seriously, a ledge. You roll off too far, you fall down the friggin' mountain. And it was hard to sleep. I was kind of scared. But I was with my dad. You can't complain. Could not complain around my father. One of those guys. Walked to school, uphill, both ways, 3 feet of snow, in bare feet. His mom would wrap pigskin around his feet, the story was. Funny thing about that, I'm in Greece. I'm hanging out with my dad. We walk out his front door in this little village, Enthusa. We walk down the street, about a football field, maybe 150 yards. We walk by this building. It's got this scaffolding around. I go, Dad, what's that? He goes, oh, that's the school. That's the school? That's the school? 3 miles away, uphill both ways, 3 miles each way, bare feet, snow. And he just looks at me and starts smiling, trying not to laugh out loud. He's like, well, I had to tell you that. Otherwise, you would never walk to school. He'd be bitching about it all the time. In the 70s in Jersey, all over the East Coast, we had some pretty bad winter storms. I mean, snow. As a little kid, it was up to your neck. That's how deep the snow was. Anyhow, we're sleeping on this ledge. I distinctly remember not being able to sleep. And there was a mouse making noise underneath me. And I shook my dad to wake him up. And it pissed him off that I woke him up. He was not in a good mood. I remember that. And he said, what? I said, there's a mouse under me. He said, where? I said, here. He went, bam, like this with his hand. He goes, go back to sleep. So I don't know if I got any sleep or what. But when the sun came up, we rolled the packs up, the bags, and my dad took this dead mouse that was sitting there, picked it up by the tail, threw it off the side of the cliff, and said, come on, we got to get to the top. I'm 8 years old. We just slept on a ledge on the side of a mountain. We climb the rest of the way. We get to the top. And there were some trees kind of at the edge, and there was something there. I wanted to say, I always thought it was a tree house. But it was like, imagine like a little clubhouse, tree house, but it was on its side. So the bottom was exposed. There was no floor. So it was rolled over, and the bottom of that faced out over the cliff. So we climbed up this mountain. We got up there, and here's this little mini thing. It wasn't very big. I barely fit in it. Man, it was probably not bigger than a doghouse. Maybe it was a doghouse. I was 8 years old. I barely remember. I remember all these details, but I can't tell you what this thing was. But it was rolled on its side, and the floor faced out. I remember there was a tree there. That's why I always thought of it as a tree house that might have fell or something. And my dad says, stay here and wait. And he had a bag of donuts, and he threw that in there for me. And then beyond that, I remember there's like this kind of field of tall grass and then a tree line. And he just walked through that, and he was gone most of the day. And I sat, at least hours, it was hours, and I sat in this little thing, waiting for him. That's it. I don't remember any gunshots going off, nothing. He didn't bring home anything. And I also don't think we actually climbed back down. I remember walking through this grass and into some trees, but that's all I remember. I don't remember how we got off of that and got back to the car or whatever. That's all I remember. But think about that. What is that? First of all, if you're going hunting, what I think now kind of revealed to me when I was telling this story is maybe that was somebody's backyard or something. You know, maybe he went there to go do something for some of these people that he knew, because there was something going on with him. I've told the story already where I asked him one time about this car we had. It was a station wagon. It was a green Pontiac station wagon. I said, Dad, whatever happened to that? He goes, oh. He says, my dad told me the truth on a lot of stuff, but he could bullshit you in a good way when he didn't want you to know everything, you know. That's what you do. And he told me that he laughed. He says, I remember that car. He says, I needed money. I took that car. He had the connections. He took it to a wrecking yard and watched them crush it into a cube, and then he reported it stolen for the insurance money. Now, the way he put it, he needed the money for the family and paying the bills and everything, but who knows? Maybe he had a gambling debt or something, you know, because he was a gambler. When I used to go to the track all the time, the horses, and used to play cards a lot. They had me sitting in on poker games when I was a little kid, playing hands. It was pretty crazy. And I remember when I was a junior in high school, I was living alone, and he'd come down once every couple of weeks or so, down the shore, Seaside. And I came home from school one day, and I walk up in front of the house, and there was, I've told this recently, 1971 Dodge Dart Swinger, two-door V8 318, green, perfect condition. I mean, this was 1983. And so it was a 71. It wasn't even that old of a car, 12-year-old car. And a 1978 Honda K-Series 750 with a Windjammer fairing on it with a realistic stereo in it, which was way too big for me. It scared the crap out of me. I had a lot of fun in that car, though. And I asked him, when I first walked up, I thought he had friends over. It was just him. So what's with that stuff? He goes, that's for you. I had a good night last night. So he was playing poker. The guys couldn't cover their bets. One guy put up his car, another guy put up his motorcycle, and my old man won. And he was always bringing stuff home. I've told this before. The stuff that fell off the back of the truck, you know, at these diners that he worked at. Semis pull up that are stolen with a bunch of stuff in them. Truck pulls up behind these businesses, goes in the back door. Hey, I got a truckload of fur coats. Hey, I got a truckload of Sears toys, whatever. So he was always coming home with toys, bicycles, whatever. That's how Jersey is, or was. I don't know how it is now. So I just have this thing in my head like, man, I wonder what he really was doing for some of these guys. Because he grew up as a kid in wartime, seeing horrible things. I know he did stuff. And he has that mindset, and I know I do. I know I have that aptitude. I remember being really upset at one point and calling him in the 90s and asking him, like, why am I like this? You know, it was one of those moments, you know, and he did not want to talk about it. He did not want to open up to me at that time. So I'll forever have these questions now because he's gone. But anyhow, nothing funny here about any of that, but I figure you guys wanted to hear. So that was just an interesting story. I think that maybe he was, I don't know. Maybe my old man was a hitman. I don't know. I think it's absolutely possible. Now, The Baker. What a great idea for a movie. So I'm going to tell you how I found my brother and how I discovered he really was my brother. And I'm going to start off by saying, if he was telling this story, there's a glare coming off this, the leg of this tripod is blinding my eyeballs here. I think I got to put on sunglasses. So, if my brother was here telling you the story, he's going to have a different version of the story. It doesn't make me right and him wrong, or him right and me wrong. He wasn't there, I wasn't there. All we know is what our parents told us. His mother told him a version. My father told me a version. So all I can do is tell you what I was told. Now, my old man, as I mentioned, he was always taking me hunting, fishing, always out in the woods, telling me stories about his life. He had this story. So this is what, man, he had this story, and it's got to be bullshit, part of it. Because the story was, he said when he came here, he wanted to go in the army, but he was too young and he didn't speak English. So he went home for 6 months when he was like 14 or so, and the socialists came through and they killed those people. And he said he was on a list. I don't know if he really said that or if I'm thinking that, but his parents put him on a boat by himself to come to America. And it's a great story of how he got here and dealing with the gypsies, rifling through his pockets, trying to steal from him and everything. And when he got here, he had an uncle, Uncle Frank. Well, I got a crazy story about that guy. But Uncle Frank had a hat shop. And I don't remember if it was in Newark or New York or some other North Jersey city. But he owned a hat shop, and my dad worked there for 6 months, but he didn't like it. Speaking of hats, I bought a hat. This was new old stock when I got it. I don't even know, 15 years ago. This is a Kavanaugh. This is a 1930s hat. You can tell by the height of the band. It always fit me a little snug, but it's good, you know. I like this hat. And then I picked up this Stetson the other day. I didn't pay for it, really. My friend got it for me. And look at this sucker. It's not the hat, it's how you wear the hat. I want to train this one here to get this side to go up a little bit more. But maybe I'll keep this on while I'm telling you the story, since my old man worked in a hat shop when he first came over. So, he didn't like doing that. He decided he wanted to be a baker. And it was interesting. He would always tell me these stories of how he would go into a place, he'd try to learn, but the older bakers would always knock the weights off the scale, so he couldn't learn the mixes. His take on it was he was young and hungry and hard worker and willing to put in the time. And that's just how they treated immigrants, you know. It never had anything to do with the color of anybody's skin. Everybody knew how to pay their dues. Doesn't matter. The Italians had to do it, the Irish before them, everybody. Everybody who came here, you got needled, you got treated like crap by some people, you had to toughen up, pay your dues, and then you're part of the team. All right? That's how it is. That's how it is. Join in any kind of club or anything else. So he went through that. He experienced what it was like to be an immigrant trying to learn a trade in this country. But eventually he learned enough. He put himself off as a baker, and he had this business. Now, at some point, this is his story, he says to me that he came home, he was living with Uncle Frank and Aunt Connie, and there was a letter for him, and he said it was from the government, and he didn't even open it. He knew right away it was a draft thing, so I guess this was during Vietnam. I don't know. Could have been Korea. Because he came over in 1950, 51. So I don't know. I don't have, what he told me and what actually happened could be a little different. But his story was that he was on the run. He was on the lam. That was why he was on the lam, which, thinking about it now as a grown man, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But because his story always was, I'm going to have to steam this, I think. His story was he'd be someplace working. Okay, I'm jumping all over the place. He had a seasonal business at the Jersey Shore, Elaine's Bakery. Not going to get into how he acquired that or anything, but he did. And that was only open for 3-4 months out of the year. The rest of the year, for 10 years, he drove all over the country. He'd been to every state in the United States except for Alaska and Hawaii. He had a brand new Mercury convertible every year with a Continental kit on the back that he traded in every year. He would work when he felt like it. If he went to some town and he could get a job as a baker, he'd work for a little while. He met people. He always told me stories about people from all over the country and places where he left stuff. He left suitcases, cars. His car blew up at different times, and he threw a rod at one point. Got stuck in some town in Indiana. Like all these wild stories. And when I was young, he was a shutterbug like me, and he shot slide film. And when I was young, I went through the slides, and I found, pictures all over the country. And I still have some pictures of him hunting and whatnot. He was cool. Really slick, man. He wore these slick suits with skinny ties and real slick character. He had a 26-inch waist till he was 30 years old. And he had a nickname, Pierre. Everybody called him Pierre. The guys would, like I said, you're Pierre's kid? I respect your father. Shake my hand. Everybody called him Pierre. And he would tell these stories like if he was working someplace, he'd look out, he'd see a couple guys in suits come in, and he'd run out the back door, and he'd come back a week later, and the people would say that, yeah, those guys were looking for you. That was his story. And he had several stories like that that would pop up over the years when he was telling me his stories about being out on the road. But every year he'd come back and work at the shore, at the bakery. And there's some crazy stories there that are verified. I mean, I know he shot at a guy there one time. There was these delivery guys came down, and one of them was this big black dude, and he had somehow, I guess there was paperwork and the names of the girls that worked there with their phone numbers. I don't know if it was on a board or in a book, but he saw this girl's name that he thought was pretty, and he got her phone number. He started calling her and harassing her, and he said, don't tell anybody. Something like this. But all I know is that my dad found out. And the next time these guys came for the delivery, he's sitting in his chair, which I don't have anymore, which I still have it. I wish I still had it. But he's sitting there with this gun right here. We're going to talk about this. This is a single shot 22 bolt action. You got to pull the pin. So he's sitting in here like this, waiting for these guys to come in. First guy came in, it wasn't him. Next guy came in. When the next guy came in, he did this. Pop. And he shot this guy. He was aiming down at his crotch, and he said the round went right between his legs into the wall. And the guy jumped up like this, ran out the door, never came back, quit the job, walked away from the job and everything. This is going to be good here. What I'm getting to with this, you're going to like. So he used to, when he would open up the bakery in the spring, he would do all kinds of crazy things to let people know he was in town. And one of the things he would do would go in there and shoot any mice or rats that were running around. So there'd be gunshots going off, and the cops would come in, and they knew who it was. They knew it was him. And the next morning, everybody knew the bake shop was open. There'd be lines going around. This is before Park Bakery ever existed. There was Elaine's Bakery. And this is in Seaside Park. And he would turn on the stoves with all the old grease and everything and let that bake off, and all the smoke would come out, and then somebody call the fire department. Pierre's opening up the bakery again, that sort of thing. So, and I had heard stories from other guys as I got older about things that my dad had done. There's a story that my uncle, I think it was my uncle, told me, and my dad was a dancer too. Apparently, he could jump up in the air, jump up in the air between two tables and land in a split on the tables. And I guess it was one of my uncles told me they were at a bar one day, and just so happened to be a black guy. Not that it matters, but he was needling my father and pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. And he said that my dad just turned away from him, you know, and the guy grabbed his shoulder, and my old man just looked like this. This is exactly what they teach in martial arts. Looked at the target, just look over, and with this part of his hand, well, bam! And he said he took the guy's jaw from here to here, totally dislocated and broke his jaw. That's my old man. When I was a kid in Patterson, one early morning, he would always leave very early in the morning. He was a baker. They got to leave early in the morning. But one morning, he came back into the house, and it woke me up. And I went downstairs, and he was at the sink, and his head had been busted open. He was bleeding all over the place. I was like, Dad, what happened? And he had stopped at Dunkin' Donuts in Patterson there on Union Ave to get some coffee. And he was walking back to the car, and he said some guy jumped up behind him and hit him in the head. But it didn't knock him out. The guy wanted to, roll him. And he said he just turned around. He did the same thing. He said, I turned around, I whacked him right in the side of the head with the side of my hand and knocked him down, but he stumbled and he kept running. But he said, I was almost passed out from the blow. But he patched himself up and went back to work, like a man, like you do as a man. So that was his story, was that he was basically on the run. He said eventually he turned himself in and then everything was okay. Now, as a kid, I didn't ask too many questions. I didn't have the life experience with which to understand everything he was telling me to be able to propose questions. It's your father. I'm just listening to what he's telling me, But he had plenty of girls that he went out with and all that. And in his slides, in the slide film, I found all these naked girls, man, pictures of women, in bathtubs and walking in the woods and by the rocks, by the water, fishing, And I remember asking him about it. It's warm in here right now. This hat is too hot to wear in here. Yeah, it might be the booze. But I remember asking about the girls, and he was like, oh, that was just a photo club. You show up, and there's just naked women walking around. But then again, he also told me that the women in Playboy, this is like the Woody Allen in Sleepers, that film Sleepers. He told me, oh, those aren't real women. They're just like blow-up dolls that they make look real and put makeup on and everything. I love the bullshit he used to feed me, man. It's just so ridiculously funny. So, flash forward, I'm like 14. My parents were divorced, and my dad had this little trailer up at Foxwood Farms, it was called. It was in Pennsylvania there. And I was living there for the summer, or part of that summer. And my uncle came up. My uncle rode motorcycles. My uncle was a good-looking dude. He had been a fireman. He was a boxer. He used to come over to the house when I was little, taught me how to fight and all that. And he takes me on the back of his bike. We go out in the woods. He gets me high with grass for the first time. He's talking about all this shit. But he reveals to me, he says, I'm going to tell you something, but I want you to keep this to yourself. I don't want this coming out one day in an argument or something. And what he tells me is that my mother, before she ever met my father, had gotten pregnant and had a kid. That's it. He says, I'm not telling you anything else. I just want you to know that. Might come in handy in the future someday. Whatever. Okay. So I forgot about it. Easy to forget about. I was friggin' smoking grass with my uncle. So jump ahead to the 1990s, like the mid-90s. And I remembered this story. So I called my grandmother. It's my mother's mother. And I asked her about it. So she gives me her version of the story and her story. Because she'd been married 3 times. And none of that matters. But, well, I guess it does. Because the third husband, which was the only grandfather I ever knew, he wasn't blood related to me. When he came into the marriage with my grandmother, he had 2 kids. Aunt Carol, Uncle Tommy. Carol was older, and she married a guy who was in the Navy, and he was in Vietnam. My mom was like 15, 16, something like that. Well, she ended up hooking up with her husband's best friend, apparently. This is the way I remember the story. I could have some of these details incorrect, so if anybody in the family sees this, don't jump all over my ass. I'm trying to remember it. So she leaves with her husband's buddy. Her husband, who's in Vietnam, comes home to discover that his wife has left him for his best friend. He's staying at the house. And the story I heard from my grandmother, and then later my Uncle Bob, who had filled in some more details. And Uncle Bob was my mom's oldest brother. He did 2 tours in Nam as a Navy Seabee. Their story was it's discovered that they're sleeping together. The guy was staying at the house. They kick him out of the house, and then when she starts to show, when they realize she's pregnant, she went to a convent or something. And the story always was she has the baby, they let her hold the kid, then they take the kid away, and we don't know whatever happened to that kid. All right. And it was always said to be a boy. Now, I'm going to go off on a tangent here before getting to my brother, because my mom died 2 years ago. And her best friend, this is all family secrets. Woo, somebody's going to get pissed. Last week's video, somebody made a comment about all the name dropping I did and like how much trouble I might get into for that, but I don't care. I'm just telling the truth. So my mom dies and we're on the phone with her best friend, who happens to also be my sister's godmother. And she tells us a version of this story where they used to have tea every day at a certain time. And she went over the house and she looked through the window and she saw my mother in a nightie, like a very risque see-through nightie, serving this guy breakfast. So that tells me and her and my sister that this wasn't like he forced her into anything. She made it happen. And then we go and we learn more, and it sounds like, because it turns out that her stepsister, Aunt Carol there, who's no longer with us, she's dead, she couldn't have kids, apparently. But she had a daughter. And then I found out through my mom's best friend that she didn't go to some convent. When she started to show, she went down and lived with her older stepsister, where she had the kid. And now we think that the kid that was my mother's daughter is probably actually our cousin Carol, who I knew when I was young. And she was gorgeous, and she'd come up for Christmases, and she was always cool and very nice to me. She wouldn't have known. But apparently at some point, she became estranged from her mother and cut her off and left the family, and nobody's talked to her in years. And so that might be why. It might be that she knows the truth about my mother being her mother. But it's crazy. All this stuff just happened. Now, we get to my dad and me finding my brother, because I go to my dad with the first part of the story, which was that she had this kid and the nuns took it away. That's the story I knew at the time in the 90s. I hope this is making sense. And I tell him this story. And he says to me, well, I know. Talk to him on the phone. He says, I know the story. I said, oh, okay, good. He says, well, here's the thing. I got a story for you. And he says to me, I have not told this to anybody. He says, you're the only person that knows this. Now, when my father and I were hunting and fishing and all that, and he was sharing all these stories about driving all over the country and gambling and shooting pool and a lot of other wild stuff, there was one girl that he would bring up more often. And it turned out her name was Jackie. And she had family out here. I think it was San Bernardino. And they had come out here together. But he met her in Jersey. And she was working at like a laundromat or something at the time. And he met her because he was pissed off. Like he brought a suede jacket in that they messed up, and he went in there to complain, and that's how he met her. Again, this is the story my dad told me. And as I mentioned earlier, my brother will have a totally different version of this. It's not about being competitive or right or wrong. I'm just reciting my version as it was told to me. And yeah, he went out with her, and they traveled around a lot, and he came out with her out here a couple times, I suppose. I don't know. But his story always was that she cheated on him, and so he broke up with her, and that was it. And then he meets my mom and marries her and knocks her up, and then they have me. And I was born in December of 66. Well, in the summer of 67, I'm not even a year old. I'm just a baby. Here's my dad. He's married. He's got a new wife and a new baby boy. And he's at the Jersey Shore again, and he's running Elaine's Bakery. Well, his ex shows up, Jackie, with this little kid, this little boy, saying that that was his kid. But of course, she had no idea that he's now married with his own son. The way he put it, and again, my dad was an immigrant, and his command of the way things work, not exactly accurate probably, but he always said that she had extradition papers and tried to make him responsible and all this. At least that's what was in the paperwork, and he got a little scared about it, and he went to the chief of police and the mayor, who were friends of his. Consolis was the chief at the time, and he said the chief right in front of him ripped it up. He said, "Don't worry about it. She can't do anything to you." But what he said to her, according to what he said to me, was, "How do I know that this is my kid? You were sleeping around. I caught you. We know you were sleeping around. You can't deny it. So I don't know that this is my kid." But I think that was like panic mode, because again, he's married to my mother and he's got me sitting there, My mother never knew this, right? Nobody knew that this woman came along with this kid unless somebody saw it. Nobody ever said anything to me. I have heard some stories about my dad. I think the reason why his nickname was Pierre was because he really got around. Like, he was the ladies' man, and apparently he probably slept with quite a few of the girls in town in Seaside. And I did hear a story that he did sleep with my buddy's mom, but that was all before she was married and he was married and all this. This is, when they were all younger. What are you going to do? And there's some people who's I try to talk to their parents about it. Like, I want to hear stories about my dad, and they will not tell me anything. There's a few people I'm thinking of off the top of my head back home. They don't live in Seaside anymore. They live in Toms River, but still. And they don't want to talk to me about it. I wish they would, because I want to hear it. I want to know these things. But anyhow, so his story is that she left. She came back out here to California, San Bernardino, and he told me that he told my mother that he was going to do a hunting trip. But what he actually did was he flew across the country. And she was working as a go-go dancer or something, or working at a bar or something. But he knew her friends, and he went there, and they were babysitting this kid. And he said he checked the kid out, looked at him, and he said that the kid had a birthmark on his ass like my dad had. Now, the boys all seem to have birthmarks on their ass. Mine, I happen to have this perfect little dime-sized dark spot on my left butt cheek that my niece's son has the exact same birthmark in the exact same spot. My dad had more of a blotch, same ass cheek, and so does my brother. So I'm going to get to this. But this is what he tells me. And he says, "I'm not proud of it, but I chose to avoid it. Because I just married your mother, and my mother was a piece of work, man. And she was already a piece of work right from the jump. Even on their honeymoon, stuff was going crazy. I'm not going to get into all that. But my mother was, my mother was gorgeous. I'll show you something real quick. These were pictures that were in my dad's wallet. This is probably dusty. That he gave me after they got divorced. I don't know if you guys could see that. But that's me and my big head. We all had blonde hair as little kids. That's me and my sister Catherine and mom. That's my mom. And that's my mom and me in the photo booth picture there. So I asked my dad about the time when I was probably 7 or 8, because my mother was such a lunatic. I said, "Dad, why did you marry her?" And he looks at me and he says, "Life is hard. It's harder if you're ugly." He says this to a little 7, 8-year-old kid. He says this to. That kind of rattled my cage there. I was like, oh, okay. Like, I didn't know what to do with that. You're willing to put up with that much shit just because she's good looking? This is, Like maybe if you're wondering why I'm single, I think you know why. I'm attracted to good-looking women, but most of them are out of their minds. So this is I just grew up around it. So that's the story. This is what he tells me. So time goes by. February 28th, I think it was the day my dad died in 2001. That was a rough one, man. I got the phone call right here. And so later that year, around Christmas time, I'm sitting here at a desktop at the time, and I'm on the internet, and I was researching myself. I was researching my name. And I did skip over something. When my dad told me about the kid, he said the kid's name was Carl Vick. So I never forgot that. So here I am, years later, 2001, Christmas time. And I had, as I mentioned before, I did a lot of stuff here in the film industry and theater before that. And I'd been written up in the LA Weekly, the Hollywood Reporter. My name's in the first ever Los Angeles magazine. I have all this. I have the magazine, I have the clippings and everything. And they weren't stories about me, but they were stories about plays I worked on where I had designed and built the sets. And I was mentioned because I always did a really good job, you can imagine. So that's what I was looking for. I was looking to find that online. I didn't find any of that online, but what I did find was a story on the Grand Canyon. Because there was a guy there whose name was Carl V. Zikopoulos. It's got my last name, spelled exactly the same way. And I remembered Carl Vick. It's Carl V. And I'm reading the story, and there's pictures of him. And he's this big guy, and he's got the beard and everything. I'm like, son of a bitch. This is crazy, man. And I don't know if I mentioned this before. I probably have. My dad was only like 5'8", but all his brothers, all my uncles, are over 6 feet tall. I have an uncle that's 7 feet 2 inches. I've got uncles that are 6'8". My Uncle George, who's back east, he's like 6'3", 6'4". Or he was. He's old now. And my aunt, my dad's sister, she was 5'11". And then my dad's grandfather, same thing. He was like 5'6", but all his brothers were over 6 feet tall. So we've got this tall gene in us. So when I saw him, I was like, oh shit, he's got the big gene. I got the little gene. I got the gene my dad had, the gene my dad's grandfather had. And the history lore is that the small one in the family is the badass motherfucker, right? That's the dude. Nobody fucks with that dude. That's the guy who goes across the country or the other side of the planet, comes back, makes things happen. That's the dude, the fearless guy. That's the guy that takes no fucking prisoners. That's the guy that will fucking end you. That's how I grew up hearing that before I even understood about this genetic thing. And apparently everybody's got the birthmark. So there's something weird going on there. Anyhow, I read the story and I can't stop thinking about it. And at the time, I had these two friends of mine at the time. One guy had been adopted. I've talked about this guy before. He's the guy that stabbed me in the leg at a biker party. And he's the guy that made Hollywood think I'm a hitman, which is fucked up. There's videos on it here. You can find them on my page. So, but that guy was adopted, and he found his real parents later in life, who were each married to other people at that point. His adopted parents are also the parents of the guitar player for the Foo Fighters, Chris Sheffield. So I know Chris. I got some funny Foo Fighters stories. I've told some of them here before. I don't need to get into that now. But there's some funny stuff there. Anyhow, he told me, he was like, dude, if this guy's your brother, you got to call him. You got to talk to him because you're always talking about your dad. And if he's your brother, he's going to want to hear these stories. And then my other friend at the time, Frank, he was like, dude, for $10 online, you can get anybody's personal information. Phone number, address, everything. So I did that. I call up. There was a few phone calls. I talked to his wife. Neither one of us remember the exact pattern of that. But at one point, he takes the phone. And he's pretty stern with me. Basically, it's like, what do you want? And I'm like, dude, I don't know you. I don't want anything from you. I just think it's possible that we're brothers. We have the same father. And he says to me, well, actually, he doesn't say anything. He gets real fucking quiet. And then I just blurted out. I said, well, let me ask you something. I said, you got a birthmark on your ass? Fucking phone's dead fucking silent. As you can imagine. There's some strangers asking me if I got a birthmark on my ass, you know? Yeah, and knowing my brother the way I know him now, he's probably like, okay, this guy's his LA phone number. He's talking about my ass. That can't be good. If you knew my brother, you know how funny that really is. So I said, is your mom still alive? He says, yeah. I said, is her name Jackie? He says, yeah. I said, well, I got this gun here. It's got your mom's name carved into the handle. So I always thought it said Jackal. But my old man, I think, had mentioned Jackie before. So I kind of put it together. You see it says Born from Hell on here. So I sent him pictures of this. And he called me back maybe 40 minutes later. And he said, we're brothers. And that's the tale of the gun. I should end it here, but I'm not gonna. I'm gonna tell you the story my dad told me about this gun, because my brother has a different story. But my dad's story to me was this. In one of these trips, when he was driving across the country, you see how this is how he used to shoot it all the time. He was resting it on his forearm. This was one of the first, other than that rifle I squeezed a round off of, so this would be the second firearm I ever fired. I still have the first round I ever fired out of this. And my dad had me shoot this into a tree, and then he dug it out to explain ballistics to me. I'm telling you, I was a trained killer at a very early age. I was literally paid by the neighbors to kill animals with my BB gun when I was young. Squirrels and such that would get up in the eaves of your house. When I got out of the Marines, I got hired to kill. I got hired on a sound stage out here by a buddy of mine that worked on this TV show. I'm not dropping any names here, but they had a pigeon on in the sound stage. They couldn't get it out, so he called me up one day and he says, "Hey, will you go up there?" So around midnight or something, we went on the sound stage and I'm shooting pigeons. Hired assassin. So anyhow, there's a lot of good stories there with that. I'm incriminating myself badly here. So my old man told me this story. I think he was in Washington State, possibly. That's what I remember. And heavy fog. And he's driving across this bridge. And at the last moment, he knows that this is his story to me. He says he knows the bridge was out. And he hit the brakes and turned the wheel. And he said the car went sideways. And he had a shotgun on the back seat that slid. It hit the door. He said the door opened. The shotgun slid out the car right off the bridge into the ravine, into the forest below. In the spring, he says he went back looking for the shotgun. He didn't find the shotgun, but he found this. This was a full rifle. It's a Winchester. It says Winchester right on it. Bolt-action rifle, but the stock had all been rotted away. So he took it, and he brought it to a gunsmith, and he had this made. You know, he carved this himself. He's always said it was an oak branch. And he carved this. And I'm going to tell you something, man. Later in life, I watched him do it. First of all, I watched him do things with this pistol when I was a kid. That's Annie Oakley type shit. You wouldn't believe it. There was a rabbit. And it had to be 50 yards away or more. Where I was just sitting there sideways. He says, watch this. He shot that thing. The bullet went in one eye and out the other. You know, later in life, he was literally walking up on deer that were like bedded down. He'd get close enough to him to assassinate them. He would just shoot them in the head with this thing. This is another true story, and I know it's going to be hard for some people to believe. He killed a bear with this thing. We ate the bear. I've told the story. This is the gun. I didn't show the gun when I told the story. He had this bear at his property. It'd been coming around. It'd been a nuisance bear, knocking stuff over and whatnot. And one day it was pounding on the side of his, he had this like double wide trailer up there in Pennsylvania. And so Went out the back door. There's no glass on the back door. He opens the back door. The bear's right there. It stands up like this in front of me. He just went pop, like that. He said the bear dropped down, spun, dropped on all fours, walked about 8 feet, dropped down dead. He skinned it. We ate it. But he discovered he shot it right through the heart. It's a lucky fucking shot, man. But that was him. My dad was like a Grizzly Adams kind of guy. And so that's it, man. The name of this video is going to be The Tale of the Gun. But you got a little bit of everything here. You got a little bit about my childhood, a little bit about where I'm from, a lot about my old man, how I found my brother. We got my brother and I bonded real well after that, and that friend of mine had been adopted. We went out there to see him. We had guns with us. We did a whole lot of shooting. He's into it, and we've had a lot of good memories since then. He's a pretty good guy, and you guys will see me there at his property and everything else. So, Carl, if you see this, man, I love you, man. Be nice to talk again soon. It's been a while. So, but anyhow, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Happy Easter. Today's Easter. And that's it. Be good to one another. Be kind. Try to help each other out. Hope you enjoyed it, like I said. And I will catch you in the next one.